Begin. The sun beat down on Alara's small claim, baking the earth until it cracked like old pottery. Her sodbuster cabin, built from chunks of prairie sod, looked less like a home and more like a stubborn hump in the vast flatland. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything, even the inside of her mouth. Alara was tough, tougher than the sun-baked soil she tried to farm. Her face was weathered, like a piece of old leather, and her eyes, though kind, held a steely glint that told of many hard days. Behind her cabin stood a windmill, a skeletal guardian against the endless sky. Its long metal arms were usually still, rusted into place, mocking the very idea of water. A gentle breeze might coax a groan from its gears, a slow, mournful turn, but never enough to truly pump. The well beneath it had been dry for months, a dark, empty hole in the ground. This meant no fresh water for Alara, no cool drink after a long day of chores. Every living thing on her land, from the scraggly chickens to the lone, dusty dog, felt the pinch of the great thirst. Alara knew, deep in her bones, that this drought was different. It wasn't just dry. It was a hungry monster, swallowing up streams and turning green pastures into brittle brown straw. She watched the horizon, not for clouds, but for trouble, knowing that desperate times often brought desperate men. End. Begin. The drought had tightened its grip, squeezing the last drops of life from the prairie. Each day felt hotter than the last, the air shimmering above the cracked earth, making the horizon ripple like a distant, imagined river. The very dust seemed to burn, and a constant, low hum filled the air, the sound of insects baking in the sun. Thirsty buzzards circled high above, dark specks against the blinding sky, waiting. For most folks, the lack of water meant packing up, leaving everything behind to find a place where rain still fell. But Alara wasn't most folks. She had a secret, a glimmer of hope hidden in plain sight. Tucked away on a shelf in her cabin, behind a faded calico curtain, sat a large mason jar. It wasn't just any jar. This one was special, marked with faint lines scratched into the glass, like tiny ledger entries. Each line represented a measure, a sip, a precious drop of life. This jar held her only water, not from a well, but from the rare, sudden downpours that sometimes caught the desert by surprise. Alara had been ready, placing buckets and pans to catch every single drop. The water inside the jar was clear, reflecting the dim light of the cabin like a precious jewel. It was her future, her survival. She knew exactly how many sips she had left, each mark a silent reminder of how little there was and how much it meant. Her tongue often felt like sandpaper, and her throat a dry creek bed, but she only allowed herself a tiny, measured amount each day, just enough to keep going. The rest was saved, a silent promise to herself that she would outlast this cruel dry spell. End. Begin. The water in the jar was more than just liquid. It was a testament to Alara's keen eye and tireless patience. Months ago, when the first whispers of drought had been felt, she had started her quiet work. While others hoped for a return to normal rains, Alara prepared for the worst. She cleaned every bucket, every pot, every old tin she owned. When a sudden, furious thunderstorm had briefly broken the dry spell, Alara hadn't sought shelter. Instead, she had been out, quick as a desert fox, placing her collection vessels strategically around her cabin. The rain had come down in sheets, drumming on the cabin roof, turning the dust into mud for a glorious hour. Alara, soaked to the bone but grinning, had moved from one overflowing container to another, carefully pouring the fresh water into her large glass jar. Each drop was a victory, each gallon a small fortune. She'd even dug shallow trenches to guide the runoff from her sod roof into larger barrels, then filtered the muddy water through layers of cloth and sand until it was clear enough to add to her precious hoard. She marked the jar with a small nail, scratching a line for every cup she added. These marks were her secret ledger, her own tally of survival. It wasn't about money or land. It was about life itself. This water was her most valuable possession, worth more than all the gold in the hills. It was a silent promise that she wouldn't give up, that she would endure. Every day, she looked at the lines, a careful reminder of her own cleverness and the unforgiving world outside her cabin walls. End. Begin. The parched land wasn't just a problem for homesteaders like Alara. It was a battleground for the big ranch families. To the north lived the O'Malleys, a sprawling clan with fiery red hair and tempers to match. To the south were the Sutherlands, quieter and cunning, with eyes that missed nothing. For generations, these two families had eyed each other with suspicion, their cattle sometimes grazing too close, their cowboys exchanging sharp words. But now, with the drought, suspicion had curdled into outright hostility. Their once fat cattle were now gaunt, their ribs showing like washboards beneath dusty hides. The endless search for forage had driven both herds to the last remaining patch of green, a small, stubborn valley fed by a trickling spring. It wasn't much, but it was all that was left. The O'Malleys claimed it by right of discovery, the Sutherlands by old land deeds. Every day, riders from both ranches patrolled the valley, their faces grim, their hands never far from their holstered pistols. Alara had seen the dust clouds rising from their skirmishes, heard the distant crack of gunshots that weren't meant for coyotes. She knew that the O'Malleys and the Sutherlands, once proud and prosperous, were now desperate. Their cattle were dying, their livelihoods withering under the relentless sun. And when men are desperate, their tempers shorten like a fuse, ready to ignite into violence. This fight over a sliver of land, she understood, was about more than just grass. It was about survival, and neither side seemed willing to back down. The air was thick with unspoken threats, a silent war brewing that could spill over at any moment. End. Begin. The tension hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating, like the dust that never settled. Alara saw the signs every day. Riders from both sides, usually just patrolling, now rode closer to each other's boundaries, their horses kicking up dust in deliberate challenges. There were stories whispered on the wind, carried by passing cowboys who stopped for a moment of shade before riding on. Tales of O'Malley fences cut, of Sutherland cattle found dead in suspicious circumstances. Each rumor added fuel to the fire, pushing the families closer to open warfare. The Sutherlands had begun to move their remaining cattle closer to the disputed valley, a clear show of force. The O'Malleys responded by calling in their toughest hands, men known more for their brawn than their brains. Alara watched from her cabin, a silent observer. She saw the glint of rifles on horseback, heard the sharp bark of commands carried on the wind. It was clear they weren't just thinking about grazing rights anymore. They were thinking about taking everything. The idea of outright seizure hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. The O'Malleys, with their larger numbers, might try to drive the Sutherlands off the land entirely, claiming their cattle and even their ranch as spoils of war. Or perhaps the cunning Sutherlands would attempt a surprise attack, hoping to cripple the O'Malleys before they could fully mobilize. The stakes were impossibly high. For these families, their ranches were their entire world. Losing them meant ruin, starvation, and a lifetime of bitter defeat. Alara knew that the slightest spark could ignite a wildfire of violence, and once it started, there would be no stopping it. End. Begin. Alara watched the dust devils dance on the horizon, swirling like angry ghosts. Each day, the dust clouds from the ranches grew larger, darker, hinting at the storm of violence that was about to break. She had seen enough bloodshed in her lifetime to know that once it started, it was hard to stop. People died, land was ruined, and even the victors often lost more than they gained. The thought of such a fight, especially now, when every living thing was already struggling against the drought, filled her with a cold dread. Her own tongue felt like a piece of dried-out jerky, rough and salty against the roof of her mouth. Her throat burned with a familiar, constant thirst. She craved a long, cool drink, but her eyes kept drifting to the mason jar, her precious ledger of life. Each mark on the glass was a reminder of her survival, but now it also felt like a burden. This water, her last hope, was also the key to something bigger. A quiet, daring idea began to form in her sharp mind. What if her water, the most valuable thing in this parched land, could be used for more than just keeping her alive? What if it could be a tool for peace? It was a crazy thought, risking her very survival for two stubborn, warring families. But the alternative, a bloody war that would leave everyone worse off, was even crazier. Her eyes narrowed. Yes, she would use her treasure, her meticulously saved sips, to bring them to the table. It was a gamble, the biggest she had ever faced, but she knew it was the only way to stop the inevitable. And begin. The next morning, before the sun had fully cooked the prairie, Alara set out. It was a long, hot walk to the O'Malley ranch, then an even longer one to the Sutherland spread. She carried no weapon, only a quiet determination in her eyes. It was a bold move, stepping into the lion's den, but Alara knew that waiting for them to come to her would be too late. First, she approached Old Man O'Malley, his face as craggy as the dry creek beds. He listened, arms crossed, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Alara spoke simply, directly, about the foolishness of fighting when the land itself was their biggest enemy. She told him she had an idea, a way to make peace, but it would require him and the Sutherland leader to meet, alone, at her cabin. She watched his jaw tighten, his pride warring with his desperation. Finally, with a grunt, he agreed, but only if the Sutherland came first. Then, she rode to the Sutherland ranch, where Silas Sutherland, younger and more volatile, met her with a hand on his pistol. She repeated her plea, her voice steady despite the scorching heat. Silas scoffed, but Alara held his gaze. "What have you got to lose, Silas?" she asked, her voice raspy. "More than you'll ever win fighting them." He hesitated, his eyes darting to his starving cattle. He agreed too, but only if O'Malley was already there. It was a risky game, a test of trust she hoped they still possessed. Bringing these two warring men, each with a lifetime of grudges, into her small, exposed cabin was an invitation for trouble. But if it worked, it could save them all. And begin. The air in Alara's small cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Old Man O'Malley sat stiffly on a crate, his eyes fixed on Silas Sutherland, who leaned against the wall, hands still resting on his pistol. Neither man had spoken a word since entering, their faces grim and set. Alara moved quietly, retrieving her precious mason jar from its hiding place. The glass gleamed in the dim light, catching their eyes. With slow, deliberate movements, Alara uncorked the jar. The faint scent of cool, clean water, almost forgotten in this parched land, seemed to fill the tiny room. She picked up a small, chipped tin cup, the kind cowboys use for coffee, and held it steady. Then, carefully, as if pouring liquid gold, she tipped the jar. A thin stream of water trickled into the cup, just enough to cover the bottom. She offered it first to Man O'Malley. He looked at the cup, then at Alara, then at Silas. Suspicion warred with a desperate, animal thirst. His tongue felt like sandpaper, his throat a burning canyon. With a grunt, he took the cup. The water, just a mouthful, slid down his parched throat like a blessing. His eyes closed for a moment, savoring the cool, sweet relief. It was a taste he hadn't known in months, a small miracle. He handed the cup back, a silent acknowledgement of the favor. Alara then poured an identical sip for Silas. He watched O'Malley's reaction, his own face a mask of distrust. But the sight of the water, the knowledge of its scarcity, was too powerful. He took the cup, his hand trembling slightly. The tiny sip was gone in an instant, but its coolness lingered, chasing away the salt from his tongue. Both men felt the power of that shared, rare gift. It was more than just water. It was a moment of truce, a shared vulnerability. And begin. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the distant caw of a crow. O'Malley cleared his throat, his eyes still on the empty cup. Silas shifted his weight. It was Alara who spoke first, her voice raspy from thirst, yet steady and clear. "That water," she began, gesturing to the mason jar, "is all I have. Every drop collected, saved. It's life. And right now, life is scarce for all of us." She let her words hang in the air, allowing the impact of her sacrifice to sink in. You too, she continued, looking from O'Malley to Silas, are fighting over dust. You're wasting what little strength you have left trying to take from each other, when the land itself is taking everything from all of us. Her gaze was firm, unwavering. Your cattle are dying. Your men are thirsty. And for what? So one of you can claim a patch of dry earth and watch your family starve there. She stood taller, her small frame radiating a quiet power. Fighting now is like trying to put out a fire with oil. It will only burn hotter, faster, and consume everything. It will hurt every single one of you, your families, your ranch hands, your animals. There will be no winners, only survivors of a war that didn't need to be fought. She paused, letting the bitter truth settle. This land, this drought, it doesn't care whose name is on a deed. It only cares about water. And if we don't find a way to work together, to share what little there is, then there will be nothing left for anyone. And begin. O'Malley was the first to break the silence. His calloused hand rubbed his jaw, his gaze falling from Alara's determined face to the mason jar, then back to the empty tin cup. The cool sensation of the water still lingered on his tongue, a stark contrast to the burning thirst he usually carried. He remembered the feeling of water, real water, sweet and clean. It made his mind clearer, less clouded by anger and pride. Silas, too, felt the change. The sip of water had eased the tightness in his chest, allowing him to truly hear Alara's words, not just the ring of her voice. She spoke with a quiet wisdom, without taking sides, just stating the hard, undeniable truth. He looked at O'Malley, seeing not just an old enemy, but another man suffering, just like him, just like his own family. The water, a shared gift in their shared misery, had opened a crack in their hardened resolve. Alara didn't press them. She simply stood, letting her words and the memory of the water work their magic. The silence that followed wasn't tense anymore. It was thoughtful. The fight had drained them all, and the brief comfort of Alara's water was a potent reminder of what they were truly fighting for. Survival, not destruction. Each sip they'd taken from Alara's jar had been more than just relief. It was a silent handshake, a promise whispered between them that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. The water was a small, fragile bridge, built on desperation and a shared understanding of life's true value. And begin. Finally, O'Malley spoke, his voice gravelly but softer than before. What do you propose, Alara? He asked. Not to Silas, but to her. It was a sign of respect, a recognition of her quiet authority. Alara didn't hesitate. You need to share, she stated plainly. That valley has enough for some of your cattle, but not all. You need to divide the grazing land, set times for each herd. In the spring, that's for everyone. You each get a share of its water, to use wisely for your cattle and your people. Silas surprisingly nodded. And what about the cattle drives? We can't just keep them here to die. You work together, Alara replied, her gaze firm. Pull your wagons, share your hands. Drive your herds to the nearest railhead together. Protect each other from rustlers and the elements. You're stronger as one than as two fighting pieces. It was a bitter pill for both of them to swallow, giving up control, relying on their longtime rival. But the memory of the water, the truth of Alara's words, and the gnawing fear of losing everything to the drought made them listen. They haggled, argued over details, but not with the fury of before. Alara, standing between them, acted as a silent referee, only interjecting when their old animosities threatened to resurface. By the time the sun began to set, a shaky agreement was reached. They would share the valley, alternate grazing times, and plan a combined cattle drive. No handshake was exchanged, no formal words of peace were spoken. But the silence that followed was different now. It was a silence of grim determination, a shared understanding that their survival depended on this fragile alliance. And begin. The change didn't happen overnight, but it began. The next morning, Alara saw it. Instead of two separate groups of cowboys guarding the valley's entrance, there were now mixed pairs, An O'Malley and a Sutherland riding side by side, their vigilance focused outward, not inward. It wasn't friendly, not yet, but it was civil. No more sharp words, no more challenges. Later that week, she watched as a small herd of Sutherland cattle, gaunt and weary, were peacefully guided into the shared valley. Hours later, a portion of O'Malley's herd was moved in, following a prearranged schedule. The old spring, once a place of tense standoffs, now saw men from both ranches watering their animals, sometimes even sharing a quiet word about the dwindling water level or the best spots for shade. The most telling sign came when a wagon train, part O'Malley, part Sutherland, rumbled past her cabin. It was laden with supplies, heading towards the distant railhead. Cowboys from both families rode herd, their faces still grim, but their rifles now pointed away from each other. They stopped by Alara's cabin, not to challenge her, but for a moment of quiet respect. One of the O'Malley hands, a burly man named Jed, touched the brim of his hat. "Thank you, ma'am," he mumbled, his voice rough. Silas's youngest boy, riding alongside an O'Malley elder, offered Alara a small, polished stone he'd found. It was a simple gesture, but in this parched land, it meant more than gold. The alliance was fragile, a seedling in dry earth, but it was growing. And, begin. Days turned into weeks. The sun still blazed, the land remained parched, and the windmill stood mostly silent. But the air around Alara's claim had changed. The tension had lessened, replaced by a cautious, shared purpose. She watched from her cabin window, a silent guardian of the fragile peace. Her mason jar, once so full of life-giving water, was now almost empty. The lines scratched into the glass, her personal ledger of survival, were stark reminders of how much she had given away. A mere 2 sips remained, enough for perhaps another day or two if she was very careful. Her tongue still felt dry and salty, a constant ache, but it was a small price to pay. As she looked out at the distant dust clouds of a combined cattle drive, moving slowly but steadily across the horizon, a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't the warmth of the sun, but something deeper, a quiet satisfaction. She had risked everything, given away her most precious treasure, and it had worked. She hadn't fought a battle with guns, but with wisdom and the sheer power of a shared, desperate need. She hadn't just saved 2 stubborn families from themselves. She had shown them that even in the harshest of times, cooperation was a stronger force than conflict. Her cleverness, her patience, and those few measured sips of water had brokered a peace that no amount of fighting ever could. Her jar might be nearly bare, but her heart was full, knowing she had helped secure a future for this land, one drop at a time. And begin. The days ahead promised more hardship. The drought showed no signs of breaking, and the sun still bleached the bones of the land. Alara's sodbuster cabin remained a lonely outpost in the vast, parched expanse. Her old windmill, a silent sentinel, still stood motionless most days, a symbol of the struggle that continued. There would be no sudden downpour, no miracle gush from the earth to fill her well. Life on the prairie remained as tough as a worn saddle. Yet a new, quiet strength settled over the homestead. Alara watched as the O'Malley and Sutherland ranch hands, once bitter enemies, now worked with a grudging respect. They didn't share smiles or stories around a campfire, but they shared the burden. They guarded the shared spring, took turns moving their dwindling herds to the valley, and when a cattle rustler dared to try his luck, he found himself facing rifles from both families working in unison. Alara knew the land would not get easier soon. But looking at her nearly empty mason jar, she didn't feel despair. She felt a deep, quiet hope. It showed that even when the world turned to dust and every drop of water was a battle, people could choose to build bridges instead of walls. Her little claim, once just a speck in a harsh landscape, had become a testament to survival, yes, but more importantly, to the power of a few sips of water, a sharp mind, and the stubborn belief that even in the toughest times, folks could find a way to work together. And